just to mention a video that I was just watching on the Curiosity channel, and it's called Journey of the Universe. And it's an incredible 1-hour presentation. The presenter's name is Brian Swimme, and he has the most beautiful method of presenting almost that I've ever seen. He reminds me of Leonard Bernstein conducting the New York Philharmonic, something like that. But one of the things that he was talking about that was very interesting was symbolism, and how language has allowed us to move what's inside outside. And by this he means everything. So look around yourself in your room. Everything that you can see, with the exception of potted plants, everything else, including the dogs and cats, are created by something internal to life. Okay, even the plants are created by that, in fact. And so what we have done is symbolically put outside what we see inside. And by that I mean, if I pick up this pen, for example, and what I have to know is that that pen was originally designed by someone, and that came from his psyche. And so he had to do a drawing, then it had to be put into a mold, a plastic mold, and a rubber mold, because this has both rubber and plastic in it. And then it had to be assembled. And all that came from the psyche. So that came from within. And this pen is a symbol of what was in here in the designer's head. And so even you were originally a twinkle in your father's eye, and even all mammals have some sort of inner vision or spirit that pushes them toward reproduction. In fact, all living things have that, of course. But anyway, I enjoyed that because one of the things that he was talking about was that all things are manifestations of the self. And obviously that's an important topic that we've been talking about. And the question is, where are we going? So the video is called Journey of the Universe, and it reminded me to look back again at this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, this time in volume 1, and in the first essay in that book, on page 35, there is a quote of Dr. Jung's from a letter that Dr. Jung wrote to the Reverend Morton T. Kelsey, 3 May 1958. And in that letter, he was talking about the spirit and how the spirit is manifesting. But here's the issue. Quote, "We are still looking back to the Pentecostal events in a dazed way, instead of looking forward to the goal of the Spirit, instead of looking forward to the goal the Spirit is leading us to. Therefore, mankind is equally unprepared for the things to come. Man is compelled by divine forces to go forward to increasing consciousness and cognition, developing further and further away from his religious background because he does not understand it anymore. His religious teachers and leaders are still hypnotized by the beginnings of a then new eon of consciousness instead of understanding them and their implications. What one once called the Holy Ghost is an impelling force, creating wider consciousness and responsibility, and thus enriched cognition. The real history of the world seems to be the progressive incarnation of the deity. Last week I was talking about never enough and how materialism has no ending. It doesn't have a good end because it doesn't have an end, and it doesn't satisfy in the end. And last week I referred to this quote from Dr. Jung from the 7 Sermons to the Dead. So I thought I would give you the actual quote. So now I'm reading from the Red Book itself, the Reader's Edition. And this, in the Reader's Edition, is found on page 507, right at the very bottom. It's a sentence that begins on page 507 and carries on to the next page. And so as I was explaining last week, Dr. Jung had a series of visions, but I'll just begin sort of in the middle of this. This is near the top of page 7. But I remained anxious and confused for many days, and my soul remained silent and was not to be seen. But one night a dark crowd knocked at my door, and I trembled with fear. Then my soul appeared and said in haste, "They are here and will tear open your door, so that the wicked herd can break into my garden. Should I be plundered and thrown out onto the street? You make me into an ape, a child's plaything. When, oh my God, shall I be saved from this hell of fools? But I want to hack to pieces your cursed webs. Go to hell, you fools. What do you want with me?" But she interrupted me and said, "What are you talking about? Let the Dark One speak." I retorted, "How can I trust you? You work for yourself, not for me. What good are you if you can't even protect me from the devil's confusion?" "Be quiet," she replied, "or else you'll disturb the work." And as she spoke these words, behold, Philemon came up to me, dressed in a white robe of a priest, and lay his hand on my shoulder. Then I said to the Dark Ones, "So speak, you dead." And immediately they cried in many voices, "We have come back from Jerusalem, where we did not find what we sought. We implore you to let us in. You have what we desire. Not your blood, but your light. That is it." Then Philemon lifted his voice and taught them, saying, and this is the first sermon to the dead. That's on page 508. So I'll just read that much to entice you. This is in the middle of an active imagination that Dr. Jung was having during his Red Book period. My point is that sometimes we go searching for things spiritual, and we don't find them where we think that we'll find them. In our materialist society, of course, we have this, where if you get a boat, then you want a bigger boat, then you want a bigger boat, then you want a bigger boat, and the more you do that, the more you think, well, I'll be happy once I get the new boat, but you never get there. And so that's why people have this feeling after getting a 63-foot long boat, which never enough. So then another thing I wanted to share with you as we're getting going here is in this book, again, but this is volume 2, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arst, volume 2. I'm reading from an essay by Noah Schwartz Feuerstein called India in the Red Book, Overtones and Undertones. And the reason I'm doing that, I want to read a few things from this essay. I'm going to cherry pick so as not to bore you. It turned out that Dr. Jung did take a bunch of ideas from Friedrich Nietzsche, who also took ideas from India. And so what Dr. Feuerstein is telling us about is the parallels between the Red Book and, believe it or not, the Bhagavad Gita. So I'm reading from page 298, Philemon and Krishna. And just to remind you, this is Philemon, and this is a painting that Dr. Jung did, which does appear in the Red Book on page 154. And so the essay says, Jung draws a parallel between the Greek Philemon and the Indian god Krishna, both of whom promise to redeem the world which is threatened by the rise of evil. Philemon, Jung's spiritual guide, was the only human being who opened the door to Zeus in an age of evil, and thereby saved humanity and attained eternal life. Let me do a little bit of an aside here. Philemon and Bacchus lived in a hut in ancient Greece, and as the myth goes, Zeus and a traveling companion were traveling through Greece, and they were asking for a place to stay overnight, and they were in mufti, so they weren't obvious as Zeus and the other god. And Philemon and Bacchus allowed them to come in and made them welcome. And so that was the reason why Philemon and Bacchus attained eternal life, because they were open to the gods. Anyway, Dr. Feuerstein continues. As World War I raged all around, Jung writes consolingly, quote, only after the darkest night will it be day, unquote. Together with a monumental drawing of Philemon, he then quotes the words of Krishna to Arjuna from the Bhagavad Gita. Whenever there is a decline of the law and an increase in iniquity, then I put forth myself. For the establishment of the law, I am born in every age. And I just want to show you in the actual Red Book. So here's my copy of the actual Red Book. And what I wanted to show you was the words that are written up next to the image. And those words are written there in English. And that is the only part of the actual Red Book where English is used. Every place else, Dr. Jung has used German calligraphy, but there he used English. That may be because English was probably the only translation he had of the Bhagavad Gita. A few more passages here. So on page 302, there's a subtitle here, and it's Detachment from the Sensory World. Jung realizes that in order to find his soul, he must first detach himself from external reality and everything he knows. Indeed, many years later, he affirmed that during this time he had performed frequent exercises in the emptying of consciousness. In the Red Book, Jung explains his rationale for doing so. Quote, he whose desire turns away from outer things reaches the place of the soul, unquote. This idea is repeated innumerable times in the Upanishads. For instance, quote, it is when they come to know this self that Brahmins give up the desire for sons, for wealth, and for the worlds, unquote. By turning his gaze and desires inward and emptying the contents of his consciousness, Jung manifests what he describes later on in Psychological Types, where he writes that Eastern introversion seeks inner knowledge in contrast to the extroverted West, which turns the libido outward as desire in the material world. Jung defines the practice of Indian yoga there as an introversion of libido. Here, Jung describes the process he underwent in his Red Book journey. The yogi seeks to induce this concentration and accumulation of libido by systematically withdrawing attention, libido, both from external objects and from interior psychic states, in a word, from the opposites. The elimination of sense perception, the blotting out of conscious contents, enforce a lowering of consciousness and activation of the contents of the unconscious, i.e., the primordial images, which, because of their universality and immense antiquity, possess a cosmic and suprahuman character. I hope this is fascinating to everyone. I'm still reading from an essay from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Volume 2, and I'm reading from an essay, India in the Red Book, Overtones and Undertone, by Dr. Feuerstein. There's another subtitle here, Non-Intentionality. The soul continues to reproach Jung for his impatience and desire-driven intentionality. You are full, yes, you teem with intentions and desirousness. Do you still not know that the way to truth stands open only to those without intentions? Jung ascribes this understanding of the wisdom of the East, as he wrote immediately upon stopping writing in the Red Book. Western civilization turns everything into method and intention, as opposed to the East, where we find the art of letting things happen, action through non-action, letting go of oneself, or, as clearly stated in the Bhagavad Gita, quote, "Your action is for action alone, never for results," unquote. She then goes on to talk about arrogance. Over and over in the Red Book, Jung struggles to rid himself of his pride and arrogance. When the heroes of the Upanishads confront this same challenge, they discover that true recognition of the self brings a release from arrogance, and the inflated ego finds humility upon encountering the self. Thus, in the Upanishadic story, the sage bursts the inflated ego of his arrogant son, who thinks he knows everything, by showing him the great truth he does not know, namely Atman, the self. You are that. So too, Jung tells his soul when she confronts him with his arrogance, "Your truth is hard. I want to lay down my vanity before you since it blinds me. I did not know that I am your vessel, empty without you, but brimming over with you." Jung's redemptive understanding parallels the Upanishadic "you are that," you being that self which is greater than you are. You possess the inward knowledge that the ego is finite and the self within is infinite. A bit more here. I'm skipping ahead to page 308. Thus in the Red Book, the soul returns and insists, I know what I wanted to mention. In this context, Dr. Jung ultimately establishes that the soul in this case is the anima, not the self. And so that's a distinction. It's a area of confusion which she talks about in this paragraph. And I said, oh wow, it's not just me, because I recall about the 7th or 8th session of this group, I did a reading about the difference between self and soul, because I was confused myself, and I probably still am, but I think I understand now that what he means by the soul is anima, and the self is the deepest archetype in the psyche. So anyway, carrying on. Thus, in the Red Book, the soul returns and insists that it is light that characterizes her. Quote, but my soul spoke to me saying, quote, my path is light, unquote. Yet I indignantly answered, do you call night what we men call the worst darkness? Do you call day night? To this my soul spoke a word that roused my anger. Quote, my light is not of this world, unquote. Remember the statement of Christ, my kingdom is not of this world. Anyway, carrying on. In the Red Book, the terms soul and self overlap to some extent and are not entirely distinguishable. Although the soul as anima leads to the self, it is distinct from it. In view of the preceding passages, one might suppose that the soul is the destination of the journey, but gradually the self becomes increasingly present and asks, as I shall presently show, to be reborn as a new God. Jung was just beginning to develop his ideas on the self when he started composing the Red Book, and as he himself admits, his conceptualization of it was influenced by Nietzsche, who had been influenced in turn by the Indian concept of Atman. In the course of the Red Book journey, Jung realized his primary goal, the discovery of the self, which was to become the cornerstone of his psychological theory. Through his drawings of mandalas, Jung experienced the unconscious structuring principle in which the ruling ego is deposed in favor of the self. The reason I'm giving you this image is because it contains a mandala within it, and it is another of the images, one of the more famous images in the Red Book. The mandala and the self. The mandala, a dominant ritual symbol in Indian culture, represents the cosmos and the inner dwelling place of the divine principle. During the composition of the Red Book, Jung found himself drawing mandalas as a means of calming his psychic turmoil. In his later reflections on the mandalas he drew in the Red Book, Jung arrived at insights that advanced his conceptualization of the self and negated his earlier Western position vis-a-vis the centrality of the ego. Here, once again, we find Jung demonstrating his affinity with India and his views on the misguided Western approach. Quote, I acquired through them a living conception of the self. The mandala corresponds to the microcosmic nature of the psyche. It had been proved to me that I had to abandon the idea of the superordinate position of the ego. Thus, in the terminology of the Upanishads, the mandala guides Jung in his development from avidya, ignorance, to vidya, true knowledge of the self. Quote, I am the fool who lives in a dark place somewhere. In that way was my Western prejudice that I was the center of the mandala corrected, that I am everything, the whole show, the king, the God, unquote. Subtitle, Mistaken Identity of the Self. A similar idea is expressed in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. A person must identify himself with the self alone. Those who mistakenly identify with worldly status or other people or gods of the whole rather than with Atman will be forsaken by that with which they have mistakenly identified. Quote, may the whole forsake anyone who considers the whole to reside in something other than his self, unquote. Subtitle, Projection of the Self. In the Red Book, Jung refers to the dynamics of self-projection or soul projection as a dominant driving force. If he does not find his soul, he will run after all things and will seize hold of them. but he will not find his soul, since he will find her only in himself. Truly his soul lies in things and men, but the blind man seizes things and men, yet not his soul in things and men. And if I cross the world, I am ultimately doing this to find my soul. Even the dearest are themselves not the goal and the end of the love that goes on seeking. They are symbols of their own souls. Here Jung seeks the self or soul in the psyche rather than in external objects. This insight is very much in keeping with the words of the Upanishadic sage when he is about to forsake his wife, Maitreya, and set off to live the life of an ascetic. Maitreya asks him for true knowledge of the self, which is crucial for the attainment of immortality. In response, he explains the importance of holding fast to the true self because of the tendency to become confused and mistakenly identify the self with various external objects, to love them and cling to them. One holds a husband dear, you see, not out of love for the husband, rather it is out of love for the self, Atman, that one holds a husband dear. He then enumerates all objects that are important to man, wife and children, wealth, gods, creatures, and everything else. You see, Maitreya, he says, it is oneself, Atman, which one should see and hear, reflect, and concentrate. Concerning the projection of the self and the illusion of redemptive love, Jung writes, consequently, we should not use the other for our own composed redemption. The other is no stepping stone for our feet. The need for redemption expresses itself through an increased need for love, which we think can make the other happy. But meanwhile, we are brimming with longing and desire to alter our own condition, and we love others to this end. But by ceasing to project the self onto others, we are liberated to form true relationships. Selfish desire ultimately desires itself. Your desire is the father of the God. Your self is the mother of the God. But the Son is the new God, your master. Subtitle, Fruits of the Journey. I'm just going to read one paragraph of this. The discovery of the self is thus not merely a psychological experience, but a profoundly religious one, a theological solution to the crisis of faith and science. Quote, I can only avow that I have experienced God, that I recognize the God by the unshakableness of the experience. The God appears to us in a certain state of the soul, unquote.